Russian military has announced that Syria has been completely liberated from Islamic State terrorists. RT's Brad Gazdiev has the latest.
The so-called Islamic State of Syria and Iraq is a state no more. For all intents and purposes, says the Russian Defense Ministry, it has been destroyed as a faction. There are still hotspots and isolated pockets, Vladimir Putin added, but with the liberation of the West Bank of the Euphrates River, ISIS is done 799 days after Russia got involved in September 2015, when ISIS was arguably at its peak. When the Russian operation began, ISIS held more territory in Syria than any other faction. 2 years and a few months on, the caliphate has been reduced to clumps of villages and uninhabited desert. It wasn't the Russian Air Force alone that did this. The US-led coalition also played a huge part. We've been covering the Syrian civil war in depth before ISIS even had its name, before jihadists hijacked the rebels' cause. Here are some of the more memorable moments filmed by my colleagues and I. This is the airbase in Latakia from which Russian jets are launching their sorties against Islamic State targets here in Syria. Whether it's 3 in the morning, 12 in the afternoon or dinner time, the pilots are ready to go at a moment's notice.
It's quite incredible to be standing here in the pearl of the desert, the ancient city of Palmyra that for months people around the world feared would be reduced to dust. In this amphitheater laid down by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago, that ISIS staged one of its sickest massacres. The Russian military considers it the crowning jewel of their operation here in Syria. You can see here just some of the impressive military hardware that ISIS have in their possession that has made the battle for Palmyra so tough. We're extremely close to ISIS positions, less than 2 kilometers away.
We're at a Syrian artillery position overlooking the industrial quarter of Deir ez-Zor. The battle is said to be fierce. ISIS fired back. As we filmed, shells began falling all around. We ran, but the Syrian batteries kept firing. Life in Deir ez-Zor is still far from normal, but at least they won't be starving to death anymore. Ultimately, it wasn't Russian or American jets that played the decisive role in this. This victory belongs to the Syrians, the thousands and thousands who fought and died to defeat ISIS. Those who stood up to jihadists, even when it seemed nothing could stop them. Unfortunately, it's unlikely that this will end here. Many ISIS fighters have escaped or gone underground. Their sleeper cells will terrorize the world for years to come. But now, they'll no longer have their caliphate to fight for.
With Russia saying ISIL has been essentially driven out of Syria, there is still the question of what to do with the group's remaining fighters in neighboring countries, including Iraq. From there, RT's Igor Zhdanov reports.
Russia has effectively expressed its outright willingness to join the US-led coalition against ISIL, the very same coalition that has been conducting airstrikes against terrorists both in Syria and Iraq. Now, of course, Russia is yet to hear back from Washington on this, but Donald Trump has already made a statement, and a rather peculiar one, in relation to Russia's announcement today. The US president has praised the fact that, quote, ISIL has been knocked out of Syria and knocked out of Iraq. And just geographically speaking, this may leave one wondering where ISIL has been knocked out to, because ISIL can't really flee to, say, Saudi Arabia or to Iran or to Jordan. ISIL only flees either from Iraq to Syria or vice versa, and we've already seen such cases. For example, when Washington was pounding ISIL in Mosul, they ran over the border and became a pain in the neck for both Russian and Syrian forces. And now with Moscow and Damascus giving ISIL a pounding, well, their only escape route is back to Iraq or just to the border. And so this, I should say, fluid situation kind of stresses the need of cooperation between the two militaries, between the Russian and the US military. But there is no love lost between them, really. The relationship is already very strained. The Russian announcement about the de facto victory over ISIL in Syria has already seen some disagreement. The Pentagon has said that they choose to respectfully disagree with the Russians, and the Russian military has responded with concern that this is just pretext to leave US forces on the ground in Syria even after the operation, even after the victory over ISIL. It'll be really interesting to see how all of this unfolds, especially with the US State Secretary Rex Tillerson meeting the Russian top diplomat Sergei Lavrov on Thursday in Vienna.
Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty, gave us his thoughts on what is next for Syria following ISIL's defeat.
There's always a question of who is going to, occupy the lands that ISIL had occupied before, after they were defeated. And I think the U.S. always has trouble leaving theaters of war. I mean, we see troops still in Korea, almost 70 years after the war ended there. And we see troops still in Europe after the Cold War is over. So I think I predicted that the U.S. would probably stay around in Syria with the help of the Kurds, of course. And so they don't want to give that territory back to the Assad regime in Syria.